Well, a great big good afternoon and welcome to everyone I can see on the screen, and those maybe I can't. I hope it's too many for one screen. I'm Leslie Green Bowman. I'm president of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation here at Monticello. And it is my great and distinct pleasure to welcome you to a first here at Monticello, this afternoon's virtual event entitled Democracy and Legacy. We are so proud to present this program in partnership with the Commonwealth Chapter of the Links Incorporated and colleagues from the University of Virginia. This afternoon's program is the benefit of a unique collaboration between these three organizations. And it's also the brainchild of one of our panelists who you'll hear more from in a moment. I want to thank Dr. Carol Williams. I also want to mention that she is a descendant of Monticello's enslaved community called the Getting Word community. We make it very special to have her with us, as well as Gail Jessup White, another descendant of that community. This is a first in what will be a series of conversations on topics that examine the ways in which young African American women consider how understandings of the past, of the power of place, and of education can inform us what it means to realize America's democratic ideals today. I look forward to welcoming you to Monticello when it is safe for us to convene together and continue this important conversation. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce the president of the Commonwealth Chapter of the Links Incorporated, Gwendolyn Walker McCorvey.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and good afternoon, everyone. I am so happy you've joined us on this virtual Girl Talk platform. Girl Talk was established by Dr. Carol Williams in the Commonwealth Virginia chapter in 2017 to serve as a mentoring program, providing a platform for intergenerational conversations for young women of color. The focus has been on issues that affect today's young African American women. Changing how we provide mentoring in the age of social media is the goal of the Girl Talk platform. This year, we are so excited and thankful that Monticello and the University of Virginia have partnered with us in holding a series of conversations with young African American women and teenagers about their role in holding America accountable to its professed ideals of democracy in America. We are truly honored to have the esteemed Professor Annette Gordon-Reed as the moderator of the panel of thought leaders, along with the dynamic and impressive mentees and mentors.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be here with you today for this very, very important event. And I'm looking forward to the ones in the future when we can actually be together. We have a great panel. And we're going to have, I think, a very, very good discussion about the title, about the subject matter of the title, Democracy and Legacy, and how that relates to us and how it relates to history. Dr. Carol Williams, who's been mentioned before, is the catalyst for this. Thank you for thinking of doing this and bringing us all together. Gail Jessup White and Nia Bates, who will be on the panel and who I will ask questions. All of you have these connections to Monticello through Getting Word. I thought I would start by asking you to state briefly what your connection, how you came to know about Getting Word and how important it is to you. We can start with Dr. Williams.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Dr. Reed. I appreciate the question. I found my path to Getting the Word and Monticello through research, through my ancestral research. My maternal family is from Buckingham, Virginia. And in evaluating some slave graves that's on land that we own, our family owns, we determined that the land had been owned by Thomas Jefferson, which was strange to us. And after scratching the surface just a little bit, it very quickly took us to calling Nia, who I realized I knew very well. And then Gail, of course, came and just wowed the whole family. And here we are having determined our ancestry related to Betsy Hemings. Thank you.
Gail, actually, you've written a book about your connection here that has just come out, Reclamation, Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, and descendant search for her family's lasting legacy. And that word legacy is in your title, is something very important to what we're going to be talking about today. How did you get here?
Well, Annette, as you just pointed out, I've written a whole book about it. It's a long story. So I won't get into it right now. However, I will say this, that it was through getting word that I was able to uncover my connection to Monticello and to the enslaved community.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up through oral history believing that I was related to Thomas Jefferson. I had no idea how or through which enslaved families. And thanks to Cinder Stanton, who became my mentor, who wrote a book called Those Who Labor for My Happiness, who was at the forefront, along with others at Monticello, in uncovering this history of the enslaved, learning more about the enslaved, helping people understand the value of knowing a complete narrative, which Monticello has been at the forefront of nationally, explaining to people who we were, who our people were, why we were important, why this history matters. So it's because of Cinder and getting word, and eventually my former colleague, Nia Bates, that I was able to unravel some of this history. So as I said, it's a long story, at least 300 pages, I think I wrote about it. And I'm always thrilled to discuss this topic of legacy.
Nia, you have a different history with getting word. Nia right now is actually a PhD student at Princeton, getting her PhD in history, and after having spent some time at Monticello. So tell us your story quickly.
Thank you. I think getting word found me. I didn't find getting word. The first time that I was in graduate school, I was studying architectural history at the University of Virginia, and I interned at Monticello in the restoration department. I worked with Gardner Halleck and Joby Hill, who at the time was doing the redesign work for restoring the landscape of slavery at Mulberry Row. And so that was my introduction to the Getting Word project. I then very quickly met its founder, Cinder Stanton, through the Central Virginia History Researchers Group. And that began my kind of ascent into her role at Monticello. And so I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to steward this project, to be a leader for the descendant community, and also to just continue the work that Getting Word has been doing since 1993. So there's my connection, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that later.
Yes.
And Annette, would you allow me to just interrupt for a moment, because you were faster than I was at unmuting, and I can't let this wonderful panel continue without a nod in your direction and letting our guests know about your incredible credentials. And I'd actually like to turn the question on you, because you've been associated with Monticello longer than I have, like some others on this call. But before I let you tell your tale, I just want to say there's nobody better equipped to help us navigate this topic than Annette Gordon-Reed. I think you all know her as the leading historian on the Hemings family and Sally Hemings, and a wonderful friend of Monticello. She's the Carl M. Lieb University professor at Harvard University. She won the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2009 for her landmark publication, The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family. Annette has too many honors for me to cite this morning, but let me just drop a few big ones. A MacArthur and Guggenheim Fellowship, the National Humanities Medal, and the National Book Award. Annette, a big bow to you and a big thank you. And maybe I'll turn it back over to you with that question. How did you come to Monticello?
Well, thank you, Leslie, for that. Was too much time on me, but thank you. I came to Monticello first in 1994 after I had written a first draft of a book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, to meet with Cinder Stanton. That's a name that will come up quite a bit today. It has already come up, to talk about what I had written and to ask her some questions based on what I had written. And that began a friendship that continues to this day. That's how I became acquainted with Diane Swan Wright and the Getting Word Project, and Beverly Gray from Ohio, who was also instrumental in putting this together. So I've been here a long time. on this subject matter. And I'm interested not just in slavery, but I'm also interested in Jefferson and democracy and the politics of the early American Republic, which dovetails. All of these things come together: slavery, democracy, all the things. That's why we're going to be talking about this today. And so I want to start with the panel to ask questions, and these are some of the questions that have been raised about the title, about what democracy means to you, and what do you think the state of our democracy is today?
Democracy, I think, is of the people, for the people, and by the people. It's really simple. It's really clear. Madison made it very clear for us. We get that. The question is, where are we today with our democracy? Well, obviously, we're in a crisis. Our president, a few weeks ago, suggested that we are living through a new Jim Crow. This is not a functional democracy right now. I am not a historian. I'm not a sociologist. I am a reformed journalist. I make observations. So I don't have solutions aside from this: acknowledgement, recognition, community engagement, vote, 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 vote. That is the only way that we can maintain and protect our democracy from what's happening today. So indeed, we are in a dysfunctional government, and democracy seems to be, I don't want to say it's failing, it's flailing would be a better word. Democracy is flailing right now.
Dr. Williams?
Thank you. I would say my definition of democracy is that it's an idea. And I think one of the things I think that's most profound about that is that it's something that's very fragile. And I think sometimes we forget that it's an idea that a group, a community has to agree upon. And I think that looking back historically, what I feel I see about democracy was the fallacy of its beginning. And I think that unfortunately, the idea that developed in the beginning had an underbelly that really damaged the purity of the idea. And if you don't understand that fallacy, then you will lose or not understand what happened January 6th. And it's based on that same fallacy that we're still tripping over the idea of what we've agreed upon. And so my thought is that the fallacy was that the idea of democracy was really developed by a group that were running from their own sense of persecution from their mother country. And while they were developing the idea of democracy, which was really a phenomenal ideal, they also developed a system of enslaved free labor. So not everyone was included in the concept of democracy from the beginning. And so because we have not gone back to really realize the fallacy of its initial impetus and really address that, I think wholly, that does the whole community agree with that premise? And I think January 6th to me was very reminiscent of the same battle over the idea of democracy and who is it supposed to be inclusive of. It's also why we continue to battle over the concept of voting rights. We're still tripping over the same fallacy of who should have the right to vote, who should have the ability to govern themselves. And so until I think we as a full community, a very diverse community, but all included, come to the conclusion that we need to have that understanding and that we're going to uphold that very fragile understanding of what a true democracy is intended to represent, we will continue to have this struggle.
Essentially, there's a lot in that African-American people, because of slavery was a problem that wasn't solved at the beginning, and slavery is racially based. Slavery's gone, but the attitudes about Black people, the question about Black people's equal citizenship remain.
Correct.
And that's what January 6th was about, in a way.
Correct.
That's what people are fighting about, is whether or not, when people say we the people, they mean everybody.
That's correct. And I think that we fail sometimes to, I believe we fail sometimes to define the difference between the ideal and the reality of how it is being legislated or realized. So we can take the purity of Thomas Jefferson's document with everyone's involvement, but even then, if historically you don't understand that the white male slave owners who wrote that document really wrote it with not putting it specifically saying slavery, but with the intent that they would be able to continue to own a free labor system. And so that is in our founding documents. That was in the foundation. And so, and then our laws were created to sustain that foundation. And so we are constantly having we're tripping over thinking, oh, we have this pure democracy, but we still have to go back to the foundation of it to understand where the fault or the crack of the idea occurred. And then how do we honestly and sincerely as a community correct that?
Okay. Naya, what does democracy mean to you?
You know, democracy seems like a very straightforward concept, that it should be a government for the people and by the people. And yet we know in our own country, democracy was established at a time filled with great inequality. I mean, thinking of the early 19th century, the population is predominantly women at that point. Women make up the majority of the population in the early 19th century, and yet women were left out of this idea of democracy. African Americans, of course, were left out of that vision of democracy. Indigenous communities were left out of that vision of democracy. And even unpropertied whites were left out of that version of democracy. So it's been imperfect in its expression in America for all of the time that it has existed. I think we've had different eras where we have tried to fix that, one being the Reconstruction. You know, we could talk about whether or not the Reconstruction was a success or a failure or a process incomplete. But then there's the Civil Rights Movement, where we again push to expand the definition of who is included in eligible citizenship, the people who are allowed to be part of the democracy. And I think we're still doing that work. I think what is dangerous for us currently is that instead of being in a place of expansion, we're in a space of contraction. We're in a space where the rights that we worked so hard for as a people, and especially through the labor of Black women, you know, the status that we've worked so hard to achieve is now being eroded by, you know, conservative efforts to constrict access to voting rights, by a failure for Congress to pass an anti-lynching law, for the failure to address all of these problems that have existed from the beginning. And so I think in order for us to move forward, we have to first understand all of the ways in which our present iteration of democracy is not serving all people. And then we can work on making it better in the future.
So all of you agree from your answers that we've never had a perfect system. I mean, far from it. That to put it that way is to put it mildly. Thinking of women left out, African American people left out, the existence of the institution of slavery, large numbers of people left out of the civic life in America. So it's always been a problem. What do you think? What would you like to see happen? Do you have any ideas about any wishes? If you could, you know, I'm not asking you to have a complete plan of action, but what are some of the things that need to take place if we're going to do better to make democracy even more perfect, a more perfect union? You mentioned voting, Gail, I think before, but that's a tough one because we're in a process now where people are trying to suppress that, trying to stop people.
I would say, first of all, education, learn civics, community engagement and involvement, talking to your friends, reinforcing what we have already accomplished as a people and as women. Women have been very successful in the past few years. I have some stats I can read off I won't right now, but we have done so much to be politically engaged and to improve the democratic system and to make it accessible to all of us. So those are some of the things I think can make a difference. And then, of course, as I said earlier, vote. Voting is not this inaccessible practice, even though there are attempts occurring right now, we
Mhm.
can overcome, to appropriate language from the
Mhm.
1960s, we can overcome the obstacles that are being set against people now to inhibit voting. And we must do that. And we must understand that it is our government. It's not
Mhm.
theirs.
Mhm. Yeah.
They're being this elusive concept. No, it's ours. So I think that it starts locally and then expands nationally, and it starts with education.
Mhm. Well, that's,
Please tell me, somebody,
but
please tell me that made sense.
well, it does make sense. I mean, you're saying is that you're asking, this is not a good answer. That's a good answer. Locally, starting locally, that is something that if to be partisan about it, you could say that people who are in favor of voting rights, which are mainly Democrats, although in the past voting rights were bipartisan. It was, the last, before it was 98-0. I mean, that the extension of Section 5, Democrats and Republicans voted for it, but the climate has changed. But certainly focusing more on local elections, school boards, now we understand how important those local organizations are. It's not just the president, the presidency, it's what's going on. They're the ones who are passing all of these bills saying you can't talk about race, state legislators and localities about masks, all those kinds of things. People who are interested in this, as you said, should be involved at the local level. So those are perfectly good answers to the question. Dr. Williams?
What I would share is, I love what Gail said. I love how you expanded that thought. When I think of education, and I think that's key to it, I think it needs to be really common. I don't want to use this as a derogatory term because I want to say it correctly. I think sometimes making it accessible and real. So as a physician, I find sometimes that when patients come in to talk to me, they'll say, well, Dr. Williams, I don't really understand about the COVID-19 vaccine, and I'm scared. And so sometimes our conversations need to just be real village talk. And I think we spend a lot of time in theory and things like that, when sometimes we just need to have an educational level that really is just about the village, understanding the village. And that's part of the impetus behind Girl Talk. I think that the real, what they call table talk, the village talk, I think we've lost touch with doing that more often and more fervently, so that they're understanding exactly what it means when you don't have health care and how that is affected by whether you voted or not. How is it that you are making, below minimum wage in the job you have sought to get? Why is it that you're having a hard time entering the university or college or community process you would like to go to? How is it that voting, actually casting a vote, has anything to do with your normal day experience? And I feel like that's the conversation that we as a village need to start having more and more so that we can understand how these impacts of not voting, what does that have to do with Black Lives Matter? What does that have to do with, my everyday experience? And I also feel that the historical lessons of the past always repeat themselves. And I feel like they did a much better job sometimes with communicating with each other when they didn't have a cell phone. And they, literally went to someone's house, you sat at the kitchen table and you had a discussion. And it took time because of course then you had to walk back to wherever you lived, and maybe you couldn't use your family phone, which everyone had access to. But I just think that when we use the term education is key. I think that it's not just our school system or our university system. I think it needs to be our family table talk, our village table talk, our real community table talk, so that we're all understanding how potent some of these decisions are and what it really means to have a voice and a vote.
Well, back when we were thinking about the democracy, asking about the definition of it, it sort of presupposes that the people are going to be involved. You know, one of the worst things you can have is a situation where, which is what we've had, is a small group of people get involved. They go to the school board meetings, they vote in the local elections, they do those kinds of things. They take control of the system, and lots of other people who could have input give that away by not participating, by voting, not going out to, to complain when things happen that you disagree with. So democracy assumes that people are going to be active. And what you're talking about is active in a way that through families, through communities, through, as you said, table talk, village talk, to try to draw people into the system. It can't work if we just, it would work badly if you just hand this over to a small group of people. Naya?
Yeah, my hope moving forward is that people will listen to Black women and respect Black women, right? When I look historically at the ways that Black women have expanded democracy, whether it's Coralie Franklin Cook, a descendant of the Monticello community, writing in Votes for Mothers that Black women deserve the same access to the vote as white women, and that the movement is incomplete if Black women are left behind. I think of Black women always going that extra mile. Black women have never conceived of democracy in a way that made it a process of resource guarding or exclusivity. It has always been a process that for Black women was rooted in community. I heard Dr. Williams mention earlier a village, right? Black women have always conceived of democracy in ways that emphasize community organizing, sharing resources, building collaborations across the spectrum, and really uplifting entire communities. And so I think we have to get to a point where the entire political system understands the function of government and the role of democracy as a space that is built on thinking about the public. That you don't have a democracy without, as you said, Dr. Gordon Reed, the people participating. I think we're in a space right now where people think of politics and government as what can I get for me? What can I get for myself and my people? And they're not thinking of what they can do for the broadest group of American people and American citizens who are contributing to this process. So I think if more people listen to Black women and follow the example of people like Coralie Franklin Cook, Carlotta Bass, Shirley Chisholm, all of these Black women who, Fannie Lou Hamer especially Black Southern women, I think, who have focused on really building that connective tissue as a major part of democracy, I think we'll be in a better space.
Well, one of the questions that people had an interest, that's an interesting, you should say that, that focuses on Black women and how we have adapted to a system that really wasn't meant for us. And yet we're the people who seem to be, very often Black women are very often the people who seem to sound the alarm about problems that don't just affect us, but affect large groups of people, everybody, as a matter of fact. And why is that? I mean, have you ever thought about why African-American women are at the forefront of at the most progressive movements, the most progressive ideas in society, in American society, and as the people who have been, as you said, really left out, who have the problem because of race, who have a problem because of gender?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. I think Black women have always been in this position because we are so far at the margins. I'm thinking of Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, that we are both Black and women, and we tend to be the last to receive things in this country, and yet we are always the people pushing the most for change. And I think it's because we have the ability to see the flaws in ways that many constituencies do not. They say know your enemy well, and I think Black women do have that keen awareness of where the system is weakest. But we always end up in positions where our labor, because it tends to be labor that is outside of the traditional political process, right? That going back to community organizing and those systems, Black women have at times operated most efficiently outside of that right to vote, which makes it hard to then capitalize on that in an institution that seems to reduce all of our rights as citizens to the right to vote, which I think is an incomplete way of thinking about democracy. So I think there are challenges for Black women because we often do what people need the most on the ground, working at that community level, and then it doesn't always capitalize.
Well, I'd like to ask you guys lots more questions, but I'd like to open it up now for questions from the audience. Ms. Hawkins?
Hi, I'm Courtney Hawkins. I'm the Diversity Officer for the University of Virginia Police Department. When I look at the role that women have played throughout history, I look at the women who purchased the land, then the next generation who laid the foundation, then the next generation who built the home. How do I provide insurance for the next generation when dealing with democracy? I know voting, education is very much important, but what else can we do to ensure that we don't let that legacy go anywhere?
It's important to talk and engage with elders, to get as much information as you can, to find out as much as you can from about what they've been through, get advice from them, learn their history, know that none of this is new, that people have been through this before, and benefit from advice that you can get from people who have a lot of experience, including your grandparents. And I should say, especially your grandparents, if you're lucky enough to have them. Their experiences are immeasurable and they can really help. And you are their heirs, and we are dependent upon you to continue the work that started with Elizabeth Hemings, who was enslaved at Monticello some 200 plus years ago. So please do talk to your elders, listen to them.
I'll echo that point just to say, I recently heard Dr. Angela Davis in a talk say that she grew as an activist by listening to the generation after her and watching the way that young Black activists have led BYP 100, the Black Lives Matter movement, and other movements that are coming up. And so I offer that talking with our elders is a two-way street that actually makes us stronger as a community, that those relationships of exchange actually help us figure out weaknesses that we've had in the past and also give us new ideas for how to push old things forward or new things from past perspectives, if that makes sense. So yeah, I'll just echo those things that they've already said.
We have in the chat a question from Danny Lawson. Danny, I suppose you put the way you pronounce it. Do you want to pose it or do you want me to pose it? I guess you put it in the chat, you want me to pose it. Why do you think we as Black women try to save a democracy that has so often undervalued and dehumanized us? In the recent wake of so much political and racial turmoil, Black women have been seen as superheroes and a safety net. This is somewhat related to before, but this is a very good question. When will we realize, or will we ever realize, that maybe democracy isn't worth the abuse? And how do we prioritize ourselves and our overall self-preservation?
Dr. Gordon Reed, may I ask you to take on that question?
No. It's a tough one. It's a very, very tough one. Well, it's sort of what I was alluding to at the end when I said that this sort of the superhero, very admirable role is one that also has some downsides in healthcare, terrible health outcomes, high blood pressure, all kinds of hypertension, those kinds of things that affect you physically, having to take so much of that on. I guess you have to learn how to say no sometimes. I mean, it's good to be strong for the community and strong for other people, but it's like, when you're on the plane and they tell you if you're traveling with somebody who's, who is young, you're supposed to take the oxygen first so that you can help them. You just a reminder that you don't let people take advantage of you and abuse you because you are strong. I mean, it's not a lot of times it's not a matter of being strong. The life expectancy of Black women versus white women is different They live longer than we do. We have more health issues. And so it's admirable to see this in one way, but on the other hand, it can have negative outcomes. So the only thing I can say is that you have to have the strength to be able to say no. And to stand firm and to understand that you want to be in it. We want to be in it for the long haul. And the way to do that is to protect yourself when you can. Any other thoughts on that? Because I'm sure you've all played super hero and superwoman.
Thank you. I would say I totally agree. And I think one of the things that we need to do more often is around our mental health as Black women. And I think that, we are strong, we are capable, we are, all those, all those verbs. But I do think that we need to spend more time celebrating and cherishing and taking care of ourselves and our physical health. So I'm curious too, because I wanted to hear, I don't know if she's just shy and doesn't want to come on, but Dr. Reed, who asked the question? Because I'd like, if she feels up to it, can she also answer? I'd like to hear her answer.
Ms. Lawson, do you want to answer?
Yeah, so I have a bachelor's in sociology from a sociological perspective. I definitely think Black women do face what they call racial weathering, the constant microaggressions and having to deal with that, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in healthcare and things like that. So I definitely echo what everyone's saying. That is about saying no and setting that boundary and saying, look, I've done the work and I'm tired. It's okay to admit that you're tired. And it's okay to take that time to yourself and really just ground yourself and do what makes you happy and not having to always step in the light. Sometimes you gotta let people lead themselves, whether they lead themselves off the cliff or not. So it's really just about setting boundaries. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. So we have time for one more question, and I'm going to ask Lauren, Ms. Duncombe, to ask it. You posed a question about Sally Hemings.
Hi, everyone. My question is, when thinking of Sally Hemings, I think of the word visionary. At a young age, she was able to think of not only herself, but the freedom of her children. Even in her time of slavery and what seemed like no hope, she was able to look past the present. Where do you think America is headed as a country, and what role do you see yourself playing in maintaining democracy in the US?
So Naya, do you want to start with this? So we can go in reverse order?
Sure. I think there's no doubt about it that Sally Hemings and other enslaved women who were thinking about the futures of their families were visionary, right? While they're in an extremely oppressive system, an extremely dehumanizing system, to think as far as they could about the future of their families and the role that family would play for our people, I think is still something that has to be important moving forward. I think my role in that perhaps is expanding access for rural Black communities. I'm very interested in how we make sure our historic Black communities, especially the ones that are most removed from urban spaces, those that are threatened by environmental challenges, those that are on former properties that were plantations, those that are furthest removed from systems of support. My hope is that I can help those communities moving forward, that we have broadband access, that we are fighting environmental racism, that we are doing what is necessary to uplift our communities that are often forgotten in the discourse.
I think what I would share, and I hope I address this correctly, Lauren, tell me if I get off key here, but certainly Gail and Naya have been instrumental in my family's journey to finding our legacy, our heritage. And what I would share is that it has been transformational, I believe, for just understanding. It's not about Thomas Jefferson for me. It was about the graves that exist on my land, and that there are people who walk this earth who we didn't even know their first name. And I truly believe that we needed to give personhood to those slaves. And that continues, and I have had that journey there. That continues to happen. I believe that my role in finding my ancestry is to give life and personhood to people who lived during an enslaved time period, so that we know the fullness of their life. And I think that that's been the most interesting thing, is to learn about Betsy Hemings and to understand that even though she was in an enslaved institution, she was an absolutely amazing young woman. I mean, there are things I'm like, wow, at 14, you lived at Monticello, and then you moved to Buckingham, and you had more, it seems, more than 9 or 10 children. You became a farmer. You also were involved in the American Revolution. You transported letters to and from the White House. I mean, the more and more I learn about these amazing women and men, the more and more I understand what I need to do. Because what I have found is that if they were able to do that then kind of what's my excuse? So as a physician, as a clinician, as a pediatrician, what I have found, a little bit like Naya, is I have found that providing healthcare to children and families that aren't on a bus line. So we talk a lot about the inner city and disparages of healthcare in the inner city. But what we don't understand, and what a lot of people don't understand, is what happens when you work for $4 an hour and you don't have a car and your child has a temperature of 104. So a lot of my patients drive 45 minutes plus, because I used to be one of the only physicians within a 40 or 50 mile radius. And so it's about providing healthcare to children and families that would not otherwise have healthcare. And you know, that it's the rainbow of races and cultures that are stuck in that that system. So I will continue to try to provide as much healthcare as I can. And health is essential to everything we do. So that's the place that I start. I also want to continue to encourage young women, especially save this Girl Talk conversation today to talk, to just get involved, to have the conversation. Some conversations are tough, they're hard, they're difficult, but please don't shy away from having them. So I thank you, Lauren, and everybody that joined in for participating in the conversation. Thank you for the question.
So very briefly, Sally Hemings was a visionary in a way, but she wasn't the only one. There were hundreds of people enslaved at Monticello and Jefferson's other plantations over a number of decades. And those people we know a lot about, thanks to Jefferson's copious notes and anal disposition. And that's excellent, because those people represent the dreams, the ambitions, the hopes of the millions of people who've been enslaved, who were enslaved in this country. So I'm appreciative of that. I'm glad we know as much as we do about Sally Hemings and the other people enslaved in Monticello, because those people are members of my family. And late in life, I was called to tell stories of those people. The work I do at Monticello is much more than a job for me. It's my religion. It's my purpose. It's my reason for being. So as long as I have a voice, I will allow that voice to be used by my ancestors to tell their stories, so that they will no longer be dehumanized as they have been, so that we as Black women and Black people will no longer be dehumanized. That's my job, that's my role, that's my calling. And I'm appreciative for it, to the ancestors, to Leslie Green Bowman and my colleagues in Monticello, and to the work that's been done in the past, because I stand on those mountains, those mountains of work and that history that have given me this platform.
Well, Thank you very much for that, for those, all of those answers were wonderful. Dr. Williams, as you brought us together, would you like to end this for us and to send us on our way?
I want to leave the young women with this. I just wanted to say, we have talked about carrying the torch and continuing the battle for the true legacy of democracy. See all the examples highlighted today. We'd love to continue to see the promise you all bring forth as a generation we're passing the torch to. Please know the road will never be easy, but don't shy away from the challenges. Do not allow anyone to dim the light that only God has provided in your spirit. Don't let your voice go unheard, and know that if you speak it, if you shout it, if you write it, sing it, tap it, dance it, draw it, measure it, or pray over it, it has already made an impact. Your voice is your power, and your voice matters. Thank you all so much for participating today in our Girl Talk